Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the drug that built modern logistics and the dark, uncomfortable truth that's been hiding in plain sight on every highway in America for the last 80 years. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. somewhere in Nebraska. A 40-ton truck is doing 70 miles per hour through absolute darkness. The driver's been awake for 22 hours. His eyes are dry, his hands are steady, and his mind feels impossibly sharp. Not because he slept well, not because he drank enough coffee, because somewhere around hour 14 he reached into the glove compartment and swallowed a small white pill that the trucking company had quietly made sure was always there. The same pill, by the way, that his wife was taking at home to lose weight. The same pill that soldiers had been issued by the millions during World War II. The same pill that a Romanian chemist first synthesized in 1887, and that nobody, not the government, not the companies, not the drivers, ever seriously questioned putting into a human body before pointing that body at a dark highway with 40 tons of cargo behind it. That pill was Benzedrine. And the story of how it ended up in that glove compartment is one of the strangest, darkest, and most revealing stories about the way modern civilization actually works. Not the way it's supposed to work, but the way it actually does, behind the clean shelves and the 2-day delivery windows and the cold supply chain logic that decided a long time ago that human endurance was just another variable to optimize. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Here is what most people don't understand about the modern world. Almost everything you consume arrived somewhere on a truck. The food in your refrigerator, the phone in your hand, the mattress you're lying on right now. Every single one of those things spent time in the back of a trailer, moving through the night while you slept. The entire architecture of modern convenience, the supermarket stocked before dawn, the warehouses humming 24 hours a day, the delivery economy that makes same-day shipping feel like a basic human right. All of it depends on one thing above everything else. Not fuel, not infrastructure, not GPS routing or warehouse automation. It depends on a human being staying awake behind a wheel for longer than a human being was ever designed to stay awake. That tension between what the economy demands and what a human body can physically do is the fault line that runs through this entire story. And amphetamines didn't create that fault line, they just filled it. The American trucking industry didn't begin with a drug problem, it began with a promise. After World War II, the United States emerged with the most powerful economy on Earth, a manufacturing base humming at full capacity, and a consumer culture that was just learning to expect abundance. Supermarkets were replacing corner stores, suburbs were spreading outward from every city, and all of those new houses in all of those new suburbs needed to be filled with things. Refrigerators, televisions, canned goods, furniture, car parts, building materials. The demand for goods was exploding in every direction, and the railroads, which had dominated American freight for a century, simply couldn't reach far enough or fast enough to keep up. Trucks could. A truck could go anywhere a road went. It could pull up to a loading dock at 2 a.m. in a town too small for a rail line and deliver exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed. The flexibility was revolutionary. By the early 1950s, trucking had become the circulatory system of the American economy, invisible to most people, absolutely essential to all of them. But there was a problem baked into that flexibility from the very beginning. Trains ran on schedules, trains had crews that rotated, trains didn't get tired, because a train is a machine operated in shifts by multiple people. A truck had one driver, and the economics of trucking, the per-mile pay structure, the competitive bidding for loads, the razor-thin margins that defined the industry from the start, created an almost irresistible pressure for that one driver to cover as much ground as possible before stopping. The math was brutal in its simplicity. A driver covering 600 miles made more than a driver covering 400 miles. A driver who stopped for 8 hours of mandated rest lost a full day's earning potential. A driver who didn't stop, who pushed through the night, who ran 2 or 3 days on almost no sleep, could double his income in a week. The incentive structure didn't just tolerate superhuman endurance, it rewarded it. And the body, left to its own devices, could not deliver. Sleep deprivation is one of the most insidious forces in human physiology. It doesn't announce itself dramatically. It creeps. At hour 16 of wakefulness, reaction time degrades to the equivalent of a blood alcohol level of 0.05%. At hour 20, judgment becomes impaired in ways the impaired person cannot detect. The brain begins to fill gaps in perception with manufactured data, a shape on the road that isn't there, a stillness in traffic that's actually movement, a certainty about distance that is simply wrong. And the cruelest trick sleep deprivation plays is this: the person experiencing it almost never knows how compromised they are. The tired brain reassures itself constantly. Into this biological vulnerability, the trucking industry introduced a chemical solution. And the striking thing, the thing that separates this story from a simple tale of corporate greed, is that the chemical solution was considered at the time almost entirely reasonable. Benzodrine had been on the market since 1934. By the early 1950s, it had an impeccable resume. It had helped Allied soldiers fight through Normandy. It had been prescribed by doctors for everything from depression to obesity to low blood pressure. It was available over the counter in many states. Newspapers ran articles about its productivity-enhancing effects with the same cheerful tone they used for vitamin supplements. The American Medical Association had not raised serious alarms. The FDA had not moved to restrict it. Society, in other words, had looked at amphetamine and decided it was fine. So when a trucking dispatcher in 1952 kept a bottle of Benzodrine tablets on his desk and handed them to drivers heading out on overnight runs, he was not doing something that felt criminal. He was solving a problem with a tool that the government had approved, that doctors were prescribing, and that the military had already used at industrial scale. The driver who took the pill and drove through the night without incident arrived at his destination on time. The cargo was delivered, the company got paid, the shelves were stocked. From every angle that the economy knew how to measure, it worked. What the economy didn't measure, what it had no instrument for, was what was happening inside the driver's body and inside the driver's life. Amphetamine doesn't create energy. This is the critical distinction that almost nobody understood in 1952, and that still gets glossed over today. It borrows energy. It reaches into the body's reserves, overrides the signals that say stop, rest, recover, and spends everything at once. The driver felt sharp because the drug was burning through resources his body needed for later. The steadiness in his hands was borrowed. The clarity in his eyes was a loan with an interest rate nobody had read the fine print on. The trucking companies built a business model on that loan. And they did it not with shadowy conspiracy or secret meetings. They did it openly, practically, and with a full implicit endorsement of a society that had decided speed was a virtue and rest was a weakness. By the mid-1950s, amphetamine use among long-haul truck drivers was not an open secret. It was barely a secret at all. Truck stops kept Benzodrine inhalers stocked alongside aspirin and coffee. Drivers traded pills the way they traded road information, as practical knowledge, not contraband. Union reps knew. Fleet managers knew. Insurance adjusters were starting to put together uncomfortable patterns in accident reports, but the reports stayed internal and the patterns stayed unspoken. The machinery of American commerce had found its fuel, and somewhere in a government building in Washington, someone who knew exactly what that fuel was doing to the men behind the wheels made a very quiet, very deliberate decision to look somewhere else. What that decision would eventually cost in bodies, in broken families, in highway disasters that never made the national news, was a bill that would take decades to come due. But in the early 1950s, the shelves were full, the economy was booming, and the trucks kept moving through the dark. That was enough. For a while, that was more than enough. The story of amphetamine doesn't begin in a truck stop. It begins in a laboratory in Berlin in 1887, with a Romanian chemist named Lazar Edelianu, who was trying to do something completely unrelated to keeping anyone awake. Edelianu was synthesizing phenylisopropylamine, a compound derived from the ephedra plant, as part of routine organic chemistry research. He noted its existence, catalogued its structure, and moved on. He had no idea what he'd made. For the next 40 years, his compound sat in the scientific literature like a loaded gun in a locked drawer, waiting for someone to realize what it could do. That someone was Gordon Alice. A California biochemist working in the late 1920s, Alice was hunting for a synthetic substitute for ephedrine, a natural stimulant used to treat asthma that was becoming expensive and difficult to import from China. He resynthesized Edelianu's compound in 1929, tested it on himself in the way that researchers of that era routinely did, and experienced something he had not anticipated. The asthma symptoms he was trying to treat became irrelevant. What flooded through him instead was a wave of alertness, confidence, and energy so clean and powerful that he immediately understood he was holding something far more significant than a bronchodilator. Alice brought his discovery to Smith, Kline, and French, a Philadelphia pharmaceutical company with the commercial instincts to recognize a marketable molecule. In 1934, they launched Benzedrine, not as a stimulant, not as a performance enhancer, but as an inhaler for nasal congestion. The dose in a single inhaler was 250 milligrams of amphetamine base. The recommended use was to crack it open and inhale. What the company knew, and the label didn't emphasize, was that the contents could also be extracted, dissolved in coffee and drunk, delivering a stimulant hit comparable to a large dose of modern prescription amphetamine. By 1937, medical journals were already documenting this exact misuse. Smith, Kline, and French continued selling the inhaler for another 2 decades. The medical establishment's initial response to amphetamine was not caution. It was enthusiasm. Doctors prescribed Benzedrine tablets for depression, obesity, narcolepsy, low blood pressure, seasickness, and what physicians of the era called mild neurotic symptoms, a category broad enough to include almost anything a patient complained about. By 1946, there were legally available amphetamine preparations for at least 39 distinct medical conditions. 39. The drug wasn't being used off-label. It was being used for everything, on-label, with the full blessing of the medical community. What made amphetamine so seductive to doctors, to patients, to eventually every military on Earth was its mechanism. The drug forces the brain to flood its synapses with dopamine and norepinephrine, the chemicals responsible for motivation, focus, and the sensation of reward. Under amphetamine, the world sharpens. Tasks that felt impossible become manageable. Fatigue retreats. Confidence advances. A person who took Benzedrine in the morning felt, for several hours, like a better version of themselves. Faster, cleaner, more capable. The effect was so convincing that users often couldn't distinguish between being chemically enhanced and being genuinely excellent. That distinction would matter enormously later. In the 1930s, it was barely a footnote. The military noticed. Of course, the military noticed. By the late 1930s, with Europe sliding toward war, several nations were quietly evaluating amphetamine's potential for soldiers. Germany moved first and fastest. A German pharmacologist named Otto Ranke tested Pervitin, the German brand of methamphetamine, slightly more potent than amphetamine, on university students and military officers in 1939 and concluded that it was exactly what the Wehrmacht needed. Pervitin began distribution to German forces in 1940. During the invasion of France, German tank crews and infantry took Pervitin by the millions of tablets, driving through the night without stopping, covering distances that French and British commanders calculated to be physically impossible for an army to cover. The impossible pace wasn't tactical genius, it was pharmacological. The Allies caught up quickly. British forces received Benzedrine tablets from 1940 onward. American soldiers were issued them from 1942. By the end of the war, the United States military had distributed an estimated 500 million amphetamine tablets to its armed forces. 500 million. That figure sits in the historical record with almost no commentary, as if the scale of it is too large to process. An entire army running on a drug that had been synthesized 60 years earlier by a Romanian chemist who was thinking about something else entirely. Japan had its own version of this story, and it was darker than most. The Japanese military issued methamphetamine, marketed domestically as Hirapon, to soldiers, pilots, and factory workers throughout the war. The kamikaze pilots who flew their planes into American ships were, in many documented cases, heavily dosed with methamphetamine at the time of their missions. When the war ended, Japan found itself with massive stockpiles of Hirapon and no military to distribute it to. The solution the Japanese government chose was to release the stockpiles to the civilian market. By 1948, methamphetamine addiction had swept through Japanese cities like a second epidemic. Over 2 million people were estimated to be dependent. Japan was living through the first major post-war amphetamine crisis, and the rest of the world was not watching carefully enough. Back in the United States, the post-war moment was defined by a particular kind of cultural amnesia about what the war had actually required of human bodies. Veterans came home, the manufacturing economy retooled, the suburbs grew, and the 500 million amphetamine tablets distributed to American soldiers became a kind of collective memory that the culture processed in a very specific way, not as a warning about dependency and neurological damage, but as evidence that the drug worked. It had helped win the war. That was the lesson everyone took. The pharmaceutical industry took a commercial lesson from the same data. Smith, Klein and French launched Dexedrine, dextroamphetamine, the more potent of amphetamine's two mirror image forms, in 1944. It was cleaner, stronger, and more predictable than Benzedrine. By the early 1950s, the American prescription stimulant market was expanding rapidly, with multiple companies competing to supply a public that had been conditioned by wartime distribution, by post-war medical enthusiasm, and by relentless pharmaceutical marketing, to view amphetamine as a solution rather than a risk. The specific risk that nobody was adequately measuring was dependency. Amphetamine is not physically addictive in the way that heroin or alcohol creates physical dependency. There are no seizures during withdrawal, no acute physical danger in stopping. What it creates instead is psychological dependency of a particular insidiousness. The brain, flooded repeatedly with dopamine by the drug, gradually reduces its own natural dopamine production. The baseline shifts downward. Without the drug, the world doesn't just feel less sharp. It feels genuinely grey, heavy, and motivationally empty in a way that the brain registers as a kind of illness. The person isn't craving a high, they're trying to feel normal. And normal, for a brain reshaped by amphetamine now requires the drug to exist. This process was documented in the medical literature by the early 1950s. It was not a secret. Researchers at the time understood the mechanism reasonably well, given the tools available to them. But between what the research documented and what the industry communicated to the public sat a vast, profitable silence. The dependency risk was real. The marketing was louder. By 1955, amphetamine had passed through 3 distinct phases of cultural legitimacy: chemist's curiosity, medical miracle, and military necessity. Each phase had added a new layer of credibility, a new institutional endorsement, a new reason to trust the molecule. By the time the trucking industry began incorporating it into the operational logic of long-haul freight, amphetamine wasn't a desperate measure, it was practically a tradition. The drug had already passed every test that society knew how to administer. It had moved cargo across France at impossible speed in 1940, wearing Wehrmacht grey. Now, a decade later, it would move cargo across America at impossible speed, wearing civilian clothes and a logbook full of falsified rest entries. The uniform changed. The logic didn't. On June 29, 1956, Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act and fundamentally changed the geometry of America. The bill authorized 41,000 miles of new interstate highway, the largest public works project in human history at that point. The official justification was national defense, a network of roads wide enough to evacuate cities and move military equipment in the event of a Soviet attack. What it actually created was something far more transformative and far less examined. It created a machine for moving consumer goods at a scale and speed that the American economy had never experienced, and it handed the keys of that machine to the trucking industry. Before the interstates, long-haul trucking was a brutal exercise in geography. 2-lane highways through every small town, weight restrictions on aging bridges, routes that added hundreds of miles to any cross-country run. A driver pushing from Chicago to Los Angeles might spend 4 days navigating the patchwork of state and county roads, stopping in towns that weren't on any map that mattered commercially. The journey was slow enough that the physical demand, while real, was at least spread across time. Sleep was inconvenient but possible. The interstate changed the calculation completely. Suddenly, Chicago to Los Angeles was a straight run down a 40 and I-15, approximately 2,000 miles of controlled access highway with no traffic lights, no railroad crossings, no local speed limits dragging the pace below 60 miles per hour. In purely mechanical terms, a truck could cover that distance in roughly 30 hours of continuous driving. The road made it possible. The economics made it expected. Shipping rates in the 1950s and 60s were largely set by large carriers in coordination with the Interstate Commerce Commission. But the pressure on individual drivers was relentless regardless of the rate structure. Owner-operators, independent drivers who owned their own trucks and contracted loads directly, had no cushion at all. Every hour parked was an hour not earning. Every mandated rest stop was a competitive disadvantage against a driver willing to skip it. The ICC required rest periods, but enforcement was essentially non-existent. The logbook, the paper record every driver was required to keep, documenting hours of service and rest, became a work of sustained fiction almost universally. Truckers called it the comic book. The nickname was affectionate but accurate. Drivers kept 2 logbooks, one with the real hours, used for internal reference, and one with fabricated entries for inspection. The practice was so widespread that state weigh stations and federal inspectors encountered it constantly, and, for most of this era, treated it as a minor administrative irregularity rather than a serious safety violation. The system had a name for the fraud and filed it accordingly. The bodies that resulted from that fraud had no such tidy categorization. Into this environment, long roads, brutal economics, absent enforcement, and a culture that celebrated endurance as masculine virtue, the amphetamine supply chain embedded itself with quiet efficiency. The drug wasn't distributed through any single organized network. It moved the way practical solutions always move through working-class industries, person to person, recommendation to recommendation, veteran driver to rookie, dispatcher to fleet. A driver who made good time consistently became a source of information. The information usually had a pharmaceutical dimension. Truck stops were the physical infrastructure of the whole system. These weren't the sanitized travel plazas of the modern era. They were rough functional way stations built for working men doing a hard job with minimal support. They sold fuel, bad food, and whatever else drivers needed to keep moving. By the late 1950s, many truck stops maintained a quiet inventory of stimulants alongside the aspirin and antacids. Benzodrine inhalers were legal and available. Tablets circulated less formally, but with equal regularity. A driver who needed a boost knew where to ask and how to ask it, and the answer was rarely complicated. The drug had a functional vocabulary on the road. Black beauties were bephetamine capsules, a combination of amphetamine and dextroamphetamine in a timed-release black gelatin capsule. Bennies were standard benzodrine tablets. White crosses were a common amphetamine tablet identifiable by a scored X on one face. The slang wasn't counterculture, it was occupational. These were working men's words for a working man's tool, as unremarkable in context as knowing which truck stop had the cleanest shower or the fastest fuel pumps. The typical long-haul driver of this era wasn't an addict by any conventional definition of the term. He was a man doing a physically and economically punishing job who had found a chemical that made the job survivable. He took a pill at hour 12 when his eyes started to feel heavy. He took another at hour 18 when the road started to blur at the edges. He drank coffee continuously, ate irregularly, and slept in the cab for 4 or 5 hours when the load absolutely required it. Then he drove again. The amphetamine wasn't recreational, it was operational. But the operational logic had a structural flaw that nobody was measuring in real time. The drug worked best on a rested brain. A driver who slept 8 hours and then took amphetamine performed noticeably better than baseline. A driver who took amphetamine to replace sleep night after night was running a deficit that the drug could mask but not erase. The underlying fatigue accumulated. The drug's effectiveness diminished as the brain's dopamine system adapted. Higher doses became necessary to achieve the same effect. The ceiling on alertness stayed the same. The dose required to reach it kept rising. By the early 1960s, the trucking industry had created, entirely without intending to, a laboratory for studying the long-term effects of chronic amphetamine use under conditions of sustained physical stress. The subjects were tens of thousands of working drivers. The data being generated in accidents, in health crises, in the slow deterioration of men who'd been driving hard for a decade, was real and accumulating. Nobody was collecting it systematically. What the government was paying attention to instead was something else entirely. The Korean War had demonstrated that civilian trucking was essential military infrastructure. When the army needed to move supplies through the American interior during the Korean mobilization of the early 1950s, it relied on civilian trucking companies and their drivers. Those drivers were using amphetamines openly, and the army, which had issued 500 million amphetamine tablets during World War II, found absolutely nothing alarming about this. A driver who could cover 700 miles in a single push was a strategic asset. What he was doing to himself to achieve that coverage was not a question the military supply chain was structured to ask. Vietnam deepened the dependency. By the mid-1960s, the logistics of supplying an expanding war required the domestic supply chain to perform at maximum intensity continuously. Goods moved from manufacturers to ports on the coasts, and that movement ran through the trucking network at every stage. The pressure on drivers wasn't just economic anymore. It had acquired a faint patriotic dimension that made complaints about working conditions feel almost unpatriotic. The country needed the trucks moving. The trucks needed the drivers moving. The drivers needed something to keep moving. The interstate highway system by this point had become something that Eisenhower's defense planners had not fully modeled, a national stimulant delivery network. Not in the conspiratorial sense. No federal agency was distributing pills at on-ramps. But the physical infrastructure of the interstates, combined with the economic structure of the trucking industry, combined with the cultural normalization of amphetamine use, had created a system where stimulant use wasn't just common, it was load-bearing. Remove it, and the schedules collapsed. Remove the schedules, and the shelves emptied. Remove the full shelves, and the political cost became immediate and visible. Nobody in Washington was prepared to make that trade. Nobody in the industry was willing to propose it. And so the system continued. The roads getting longer, the schedules getting tighter, the pills getting more necessary, and the question of what this was doing to the human beings at the centre of it getting quieter and quieter the more important the answer became. The trucks kept rolling, the logbooks kept lying. And somewhere between Chicago and Los Angeles, on a stretch of interstate that Eisenhower had built to move tanks, a man who hadn't slept in 20 hours reached into his glove compartment for the third time that week and made the calculation that had already been made for him by everyone above him in the chain, that arriving on time mattered more than arriving intact. There is a precise moment in the arc of amphetamine dependency when the drug stops being a tool and starts being a requirement. It doesn't announce itself. There's no single morning when a driver wakes up and understands that the chemistry of his brain has been permanently renegotiated. The transition happens gradually, invisibly, across hundreds of shifts and thousands of miles, until one day the absence of the drug feels not like sobriety but like illness, and the presence of it feels not like enhancement but like baseline. By the late 1960s, that transition had happened to an enormous and uncounted number of American truck drivers. The scale is difficult to reconstruct precisely because nobody was counting. There were no addiction registries for working truckers, no systematic medical screenings, no HR departments flagging concerning patterns. What existed instead were the accumulated observations of dispatchers, truck stop owners, highway patrolmen, and emergency room physicians, people who saw the same men regularly and noticed, without the language to fully describe it, that something had shifted. The shift was neurological, and its mechanism was coldly straightforward. The human brain maintains dopamine balance through a feedback system. When dopamine floods the synapses, whether from a natural reward or a chemical stimulus, the brain responds by reducing its own dopamine production and decreasing the sensitivity of dopamine receptors. It's a compensatory mechanism designed to maintain equilibrium. Under normal circumstances, this system works well. Under sustained amphetamine use, it works against the user with mathematical precision. The brain's natural dopamine output drops to accommodate the artificial supply. When the artificial supply disappears, the natural output isn't sufficient to fill the gap. The result isn't withdrawal in the acute physical sense. It's a motivational collapse, a flatness, a heaviness, a sense that the world has lost whatever made it worth engaging with. Drivers describe this state in practical terms rather than psychological ones. Off the road, they couldn't sleep properly even when exhausted. The sleep that came was shallow and unrefreshing, full of vivid and unpleasant dreams. Food lost its appeal. Simple tasks at home, fixing something in the yard, talking to the kids, sitting with a wife in the evening, required effort that felt disproportionate to the task. The world at home was slow and muted and demanding in ways the road wasn't. On the road, at least, there was forward motion. There was a destination. There was the pill. Some drivers began taking amphetamine not at the start of a long run, but at the start of every day, regardless of whether a run was scheduled. The drug had become the mechanism by which they accessed functional personhood. Without it, mornings were something to be endured. With it, they were manageable. The transition from occupational use to daily dependency had completed itself quietly, without drama, in the space between one logbook entry and the next. The trucking companies were not oblivious to this process. Some dispatchers were actively complicit in accelerating it. Pill jars on dispatcher desks were not urban legend. They were documented in later congressional testimony and in the memoirs of drivers who worked through this era. A dispatcher whose drivers consistently made schedule had professional reasons to keep those drivers chemically operational. The transaction was rarely explicit. It didn't need to be. A jar on a desk communicates everything without a word being spoken. A driver who hesitated could look at the delivery window and do his own math. The insurance industry, operating from a different set of incentives, began assembling a picture that the trucking companies had every reason to avoid examining. Actuarial data from the mid-1960s onward showed a consistent pattern in trucking accidents, a significant cluster in the 14 to 18-hour range of a driving shift. Not at hour 5, when a fresh driver might be overconfident. Not at hour 8, when fatigue first appears. At hours 14 through 18, precisely the window when a driver who had taken amphetamine at the start of his shift would be experiencing the drug's decline. Not peak fatigue, the crash after artificial alertness, the specific danger zone that amphetamine created rather than prevented. This data reached the insurance company's pricing models before it reached any regulatory body. Premiums for long-haul trucking reflected the risk without anyone in the industry having to acknowledge what the risk actually was. The cost of the drug's damage was being quietly distributed across the entire insurance market, while the cause remained officially unnamed. The physical deterioration of chronic amphetamine users followed a predictable pattern that occupational medicine was beginning to document in the late 1960s. Cardiovascular stress was primary. Amphetamine elevates heart rate and blood pressure consistently, and sustained elevation over years produces the same damage as chronic hypertension. Men in their late 30s and 40s were presenting with cardiac conditions normally associated with men 20 years older. Dental destruction, meth mouth, in its modern form has a predecessor in the dry mouth, teeth-grinding side effects of long-term amphetamine use, was common enough in trucking communities to be considered an occupational characteristic rather than a medical symptom. Weight loss, chronic dehydration, and immune suppression from disrupted sleep completed the profile. But the damage that was hardest to see and easiest to ignore was psychological. Prolonged amphetamine use produces paranoia in a significant percentage of users, not dramatic movie villain paranoia, but a low-grade suspicion of colleagues, a tendency to interpret neutral events as hostile, a generalized sense that the environment is more threatening than it is. Drivers operating in this state were not obvious to casual observers. They functioned. They delivered their loads. They filled out their comic book logbooks with the practiced ease of long habit. What they couldn't do reliably was make good decisions under pressure, assess risk accurately, or recognize when their own perception had become untrustworthy. A driver in this condition behind the wheel of a 40-ton truck at 65 miles per hour was not a driver having a bad day. He was a predictable accident in a specific location on a specific future date, moving steadily toward that location with every mile he covered. The families of these men experienced the dependency differently, not as a road problem, but as a home problem. A driver who was functional on amphetamine became someone his family didn't entirely recognize when he was off it. The irritability, the flatness, the inability to engage with ordinary domestic life, these presented as personality changes that wives and children had no framework to understand. Trucking culture provided no emotional vocabulary for this. The driver was a provider. The road was his world. What happened on the road stayed on the road, including the chemistry that made the road survivable. Divorce rates in trucking communities during this era ran significantly above national averages, a statistic that the industry attributed to the structural stress of long absences. The absences were real, and they contributed. But they weren't the whole explanation. A man who could only feel like himself when he was chemically altered and moving at speed was not a man who came home whole. He came home as a diminished version, counting the hours until he could leave again, until the next load gave him the only context in which the pill made him functional rather than dependent. By 1968, the system had reached a state of profound internal contradiction. The trucking industry was essential, profitable, and growing. The drivers running it were, in substantial numbers, physiologically compromised, psychologically altered, and operating equipment that could kill dozens of people if they made one wrong decision at the wrong moment. The drug that had enabled the industry's growth had become a structural feature of its operation, impossible to remove without collapsing the schedules, impossible to keep without continuing to destroy the men who ran it. The contradiction was not unknown. It was documented, discussed in industry publications, and quietly acknowledged in private conversations at every level of the supply chain. What it was not in 1968 was anyone's official problem. The trucks were moving. The economy was growing. The Vietnam War was consuming political oxygen on every front. And the drivers, the actual human beings at the centre of this system, were still reaching into glove compartments, still swallowing pills that had stopped making them sharp and were now just keeping them from falling apart, still covering Ohio to California on schedules that a well-rested human being with a functional brain couldn't have managed. The bill for all of this was coming. It was already overdue, and when it finally arrived, it wouldn't come in the form of a policy memo or a regulatory action. It would come in the form of wreckage on American highways, wreckage specific enough and terrible enough that even a system practiced in the art of looking away would find it impossible to ignore. The accidents didn't look like drug accidents. That was the first problem, and in many ways the most consequential one. When a fatigued driver on the back end of an amphetamine crash crossed a centre line at 3 a.m. and destroyed everything in his path, the official report recorded driver fatigue as the cause, not stimulant dependency, not amphetamine withdrawal, fatigue. A word clean enough to file, vague enough to bury, and common enough that nobody reading the report would ask the follow-up question that mattered most. Why was a professional driver, bound by federal hours of service regulations, fatigued enough to kill people? The answer to that question was sitting in the glove compartment, but glove compartments weren't part of the accident investigation protocol. Understanding what amphetamine actually does to a driver at the end of its cycle requires stepping inside the pharmacology for a moment. The drug stimulant effect lasts at therapeutic doses between 4 and 6 hours. After that window closes, the brain, which has been running hot, burning through its dopamine reserves at an accelerated rate, does not return to normal baseline. It drops below it. The technical term is hypodopaminergic rebound. The practical experience is a sudden, profound heaviness that arrives without warning and hits the body like a physical blow. Not tiredness, collapse. The distinction matters enormously when the person experiencing it is controlling a vehicle weighing 40 tons at highway speed. A driver who took his last pill at midnight and had been running on its effect would hit rebound somewhere around 5 or 6 a.m., prime time on the interstate, when traffic was beginning to build and the expectation of alertness was highest. The rebound didn't creep in the way ordinary fatigue did. It fell. Drivers who experienced it described a sensation of the road suddenly becoming distant, of the hands on the wheel feeling disconnected from the body, of the simple act of maintaining lane position requiring a conscious effort that it had never required before. Some reported microsleeps, brief, complete losses of consciousness lasting 2 to 30 seconds, that they were unaware of until they registered the change position of the truck on the road. 2 seconds at 65 miles per hour covers 190 feet. 30 seconds covers nearly half a mile. In that distance, an unguided 40-ton truck becomes a ballistic object. The crash statistics from this era are difficult to parse precisely because the recording methodology was inconsistent across states and years. But the National Transportation Safety Board, in analyses conducted in the early 1970s when the political pressure to examine trucking safety finally became too loud to ignore, found that large truck crashes were occurring at rates that bore no reasonable relationship to the mechanical reliability of the vehicles or the nominal training requirements for the drivers. The trucks were mechanically sound. The drivers were nominally qualified. Something else was causing the accidents at a frequency that random chance and normal human error couldn't fully explain. That something else had a name that the NTSB reports carefully avoided using directly. The language in official documents from this period is a masterpiece of strategic vagueness. References to impaired alertness, degraded decision-making capacity, and fatigue-adjacent cognitive states that any pharmacologist reading them would immediately recognize as descriptions of stimulant crash syndrome. The language was chosen to describe the effect without naming the cause. The cause, named plainly, would have required naming the industry practices that produced it. Nobody with the authority to name them had the incentive to do so. Individual disasters punctuated this era with the regularity of a system operating at the edge of its tolerance. A produce truck losing control on a California grade and destroying 4 passenger vehicles, killing 6 people, with a driver who'd been behind the wheel for 26 consecutive hours. A fuel tanker crossing the median on E70 in Ohio. The resulting fire closing the interstate for 11 hours and producing a casualty count that the local news covered for 3 days before the story disappeared into the ordinary background noise of American highway danger. A flatbed carrying steel pipe running a red light at the intersection of 2 state routes in rural Tennessee. The pipe becoming projectiles that travelled 200 feet beyond the crash site. In each case, driver fatigue was noted. In each case, the investigation stopped there. The families of victims killed in these crashes occupied a particular kind of grief, not just the ordinary devastation of sudden loss, but the additional weight of a cause that was simultaneously obvious and officially invisible. They knew or suspected what had really happened. The trucking companies knew. The insurance adjusters who handled the claims knew. The lawyers who negotiated the settlements, usually with confidentiality clauses that prevented public discussion of the details, definitely knew. The knowledge was distributed widely across the system and acted upon precisely nowhere. In 1965, a research firm contracted by a consortium of major trucking companies produced an internal report on driver stimulant use. The report was not intended for public consumption. It was a risk assessment designed to help the companies understand their liability exposure. The researchers surveyed drivers with guaranteed anonymity and cross-referenced self-reported stimulant use with accident records, health insurance claims, and dispatch logs. The findings were stark. Over 60% of long-haul drivers surveyed reported regular stimulant use during driving shifts. Among drivers who had been involved in serious accidents in the preceding 3 years, the figure was over 80%. The correlation wasn't subtle, it wasn't ambiguous. It was a number that, if published, would have triggered federal intervention, criminal liability investigations, and insurance restructuring across the entire industry. The report was buried, not destroyed, buried. Copies were distributed to the legal departments of the commissioning companies, where they were filed under attorney-client privilege. The researchers were paid and their contract was concluded. The data entered a kind of administrative purgatory, where it existed technically, but could not be accessed, discussed, or acted upon. It would remain there for years, protected by the same legal architecture that protected every other inconvenient truth the industry had generated. What filtered out of that buried report, not through leaks or whistleblowers, but through the slow accumulation of pressure from multiple directions, was a growing unease in Washington. Congressional staffers were receiving constituent letters about trucking accidents with unusual frequency. The emerging consumer safety movement, energized by Ralph Nader's 1965 assault on the auto industry, was casting its attention toward highway safety more broadly. The NTSB, established in 1967, was beginning to produce analyses that the trucking industry's political allies in Congress found increasingly difficult to dismiss. The industry's response to this pressure was a model of defensive sophistication. Trade associations launched voluntary safety initiatives with impressive-sounding names and negligible operational impact. Individual companies announced internal policy changes prohibiting stimulant use, policies enforced with the same rigour as the hours of service regulations, which is to say, not at all. The public-facing narrative was one of a responsible industry taking self-regulatory action, which had the dual advantage of demonstrating good faith and forestalling mandatory federal intervention. Meanwhile, on the actual roads, the actual situation was unchanged. Drivers were still running impossible schedules. Dispatchers were still maintaining their quiet inventories. The accidents were still clustering at hours 14 through 18. The gap between the industry's public narrative and its operational reality was wide enough to drive a truck through, and every day it did. The political system's failure to act in this window, the late 1960s, when the evidence was available, when the causal chain was understood, when intervention was still possible before the drug supply shifted to something far more dangerous, is not a mystery. It is a straightforward story about the distribution of power and the distribution of consequences. The people with the power to act were not the people experiencing the consequences. The drivers experiencing the consequences had neither the political organisation nor the cultural standing to demand action effectively. The Teamsters Union, which should have been their advocate, was in this era more occupied with its own internal power struggles and its complicated relationship with organised crime than with the occupational health of the men it represented. And so the window closed. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 would eventually arrive and reclassify amphetamines, but by then the industry had 20 years of practiced adaptation to draw on. It would not be difficult to find substitutes. It would not be difficult to continue. The only thing that would genuinely change was the name of the drug, and the name in this story had never been the point. Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act into law on October 27, 1970, and the pharmaceutical landscape of America was permanently reorganized overnight. Amphetamines became Schedule II, recognized as having medical utility but carrying high dependency potential, requiring a written prescription, non-refillable, tracked. The casual over-the-counter availability that had defined the drug's first 4 decades in American life was legally terminated. For the trucking industry, which had built its operational rhythm around that availability, this should have been a crisis. It wasn't. It was an inconvenience that lasted approximately 18 months. The adaptation happened at multiple levels simultaneously, with the kind of distributed ingenuity that emerges when a large number of motivated people face a common obstacle. The first and most immediate solution was the prescription system itself. The Controlled Substances Act required a prescription, but it did not require that the prescribing physician have examined the patient thoroughly, verified a legitimate medical need, or maintained any particular concern for long-term outcomes. What it required, technically, was a piece of paper with a doctor's signature, and in the trucking corridors of 1971 America, doctors who were willing to provide that paper were not difficult to find. These physicians operated at the permeable edge of medical legitimacy, not always breaking the law explicitly, but bending it with a consistency that the DEA would later describe as prescription mills. A driver coming through a town on a regular route would establish a relationship with a local doctor, receive a diagnosis of narcolepsy or attention deficit disorder, or some other condition that amphetamine legitimately treated, and walk out with a prescription that he could fill at the pharmacy down the street. The prescription was real. The diagnosis was, in many cases, a collaborative fiction between a willing doctor and a motivated patient. The pills were identical to the ones that had been in the glove compartment all along. The DEA, newly created by Nixon's executive order in 1973, was supposed to close this loophole. In practice, the agency's early years were consumed by the heroin epidemic, the emerging cocaine trade, and the political theatre of the war on drugs, which focused its public energy on street-level dealers and urban drug use rather than on a white working-class population consuming stimulants for occupational reasons. Truckers didn't fit the war on drugs preferred narrative. They were not the enemy the political campaign had been designed to fight. They were, if anything, culturally adjacent to the political base that supported the campaign, so the prescription mills operated. The Schedule II designation made amphetamines slightly harder to get and slightly more expensive, but it did not make it unavailable. For drivers with established routes and established relationships, the transition from over-the-counter to prescription was a bureaucratic inconvenience measured in extra stops and small co-pays. For drivers without those relationships, or for those who found the prescription route too cumbersome, the market provided alternatives with remarkable speed. Ephedrine, the natural compound that Gordon Alice had been trying to synthesize a replacement for back in 1929, was not scheduled under the CSA. It was legally available in tablet form, marketed as a bronchodilator and decongestant, and its stimulant effects, while milder than amphetamine, were sufficient for a driver needing to extend a shift by 4 or 5 hours. Truck stops began stocking ephedrine products prominently, often in displays positioned near the coffee station, in packaging that made their intended use unmistakably clear to anyone who understood the market. The brand names of this era read like a catalogue of barely concealed intent. Trucker's Friend, Super Trucker, Road Warrior. These were real products, sold legally, distributed openly, and consumed by the millions of tablets annually at truck stops across the interstate system. They contained ephedrine, caffeine, and various combinations of legal stimulants in doses calibrated not for an asthma patient, but for a man trying to stay functional behind a wheel for 18 hours. The FDA's position on these products throughout most of the 1970s and 80s was one of studied uncertainty, not approving them for stimulant use, not banning them from the market, existing in a regulatory grey zone that served everyone's interests except the drivers consuming them. The Highway Patrol knew exactly what the products were for. Way station operators knew. DOT inspectors knew. The knowledge was universal, and the enforcement was minimal, because the enforcement would have required an honest conversation about what was actually keeping the supply chain moving. A conversation that nobody in the regulatory apparatus had been authorized to have. Underneath the legal stimulant market, a parallel supply was developing, that would eventually make the pharmaceutical amphetamine problem look minor by comparison. Methamphetamine, chemically almost identical to amphetamine, 2 to 3 times more potent and synthesizable from legally available precursor chemicals, was beginning to appear in trucking communities by the mid-1970s. It arrived not through organized crime networks or urban drug markets, but through the same informal peer-to-peer distribution channels that had always supplied the road. A driver knew a driver who knew someone near Tulsa who cooked it in a mobile lab and sold it for a fraction of what a prescription stimulant cost. The early meth supply in trucking culture was local, inconsistent, and relatively small in scale. But its growth trajectory followed the logic of any market responding to demand. The demand was enormous, the supply was initially limited, and anyone who could reliably produce the product had a customer base that was geographically distributed across the entire interstate network and highly motivated to maintain a steady supply. Small-scale producers near major truck corridors expanded. Word travelled at the speed of CB radio chatter. By the late 1970s, methamphetamine had established a significant presence in long-haul trucking, not replacing the legal stimulants, but supplementing them, available for the runs where ephedrine wasn't enough and a prescription was too much trouble to maintain. The DEA's internal documents from this period reveal an agency acutely aware of the meth trucking connection and genuinely uncertain about how to address it. Field agents in Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, and Nevada were filing reports about production and distribution networks that trace directly to truck stop supply chains. Regional supervisors understood the scope of the problem. What was less clear was the mandate to pursue it aggressively, given the supply chain implications and the political complications of targeting an industry that the Reagan administration, which declared the modern war on drugs in 1982, was simultaneously celebrating as the backbone of American commerce. The Reagan-era war on drugs produced some of the most visible amphetamine enforcement of the decade, while managing to leave the trucking industry's stimulant dependency almost entirely undisturbed. The public campaign focused on crack cocaine in urban areas, generating dramatic television imagery and satisfying political narratives about inner-city crime. The meth problem in rural trucking corridors generated no comparable imagery and fit no comparable narrative. It was invisible not because it was small, but because it was inconvenient to see. What the legal chaos of this era ultimately produced was not a reduction in stimulant use among truck drivers. It produced a shift from a relatively stable, pharmaceutical-grade supply of amphetamine to an unstable, variable-quality supply of methamphetamine, a drug more potent, more dependency-forming, and more neurologically destructive than the benzodrine that had started the whole system 4 decades earlier. The regulation had not solved the problem. It had compressed it, redirected it, and handed it to a supply chain with no quality control, no dosing standards, and no interest in the long-term health of its customers. The system had traded a managed disaster for an unmanaged one, and the unmanaged one was just getting started. The geography of early American methamphetamine production is not random. Plot the locations of the first significant meth labs identified by DEA field agents in the late 1970s and early 1980s on a map, then overlay that map with the interstate highway system, and the correlation is immediate and unmistakable. The labs cluster along the corridors, not in the cities the interstates connect, but in the small towns between them, the places where a truck stop is the most significant commercial establishment for 30 miles in any direction, where local law enforcement is thin, where chemical supply companies don't ask many questions, and where a steady stream of long-haul drivers passes through every single day of the year. This wasn't coincidence, it was market geography. The early meth cooks of the American interior weren't chemists in any formal sense. They were practical men, often with military or agricultural backgrounds that gave them familiarity with chemical processes, who had identified a demand, located a supply of precursor chemicals, and built a production operation scaled to serve the specific market, passing through their town on the interstate. The birch reduction method, which used anhydrous ammonia, available in enormous quantities on every agricultural property in the Midwest, and lithium from batteries to convert ephedrine into methamphetamine, was simple enough to execute in a shed or a mobile home with equipment available at any hardware store. The barriers to entry were almost non-existent. The profit margins were extraordinary. The product that reached drivers through these networks was dramatically different from the pharmaceutical amphetamine it was replacing. Pharmaceutical benzodrine had been manufactured under controlled conditions to consistent purity standards. The meth coming out of rural Oklahoma or central Nevada in the early 1980s was of wildly variable quality, sometimes 40% pure, sometimes 90%, with the difference between those two numbers representing the difference between a manageable stimulant effect and a cardiovascular event. Drivers had no way to assess purity. They had no dosing guidance. They had a product, a price, and a schedule to meet. The potency difference between amphetamine and methamphetamine matters clinically. Meth crosses the blood-brain barrier more rapidly and completely than amphetamine. Its effect on dopamine release is approximately 3 times more intense. The subjective experience is correspondingly more powerful. A rush of confidence and capability that pharmaceutical benzodrine, for all its effects, had never quite delivered at standard doses. For a driver who'd been using stimulants for years, and whose dopamine system had already been recalibrated downward by chronic amphetamine exposure, methamphetamine's intensity felt like a correction, like finally getting enough. That feeling, the sensation of finally getting enough, is one of the most reliable markers of a dependency trap closing around a person. It signals that the brain's baseline has shifted so far from its natural state that only an abnormally powerful stimulus can reach it. The driver who felt that his new supply was finally working was a driver whose neurology had been so thoroughly reorganized by years of stimulant use that he now required methamphetamine to achieve what benzodrine had once achieved with a fraction of the neurological cost. The trucking culture of the 1980s absorbed methamphetamine with the same pragmatic lack of ceremony with which it had absorbed everything else. New slang emerged, crank, the most common term, reportedly derived from the practice of hiding the drug in the crankcase of a motorcycle, though the etymology was disputed and probably mythologized after the fact. Crank had a working-class directness that suited the culture. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't countercultural, it was occupational, it did a job. What it did to the men using it, over months and years, was qualitatively different from what amphetamine had done. More severe, more rapid, more permanent. Methamphetamine's neurological damage accumulates faster because the drug's intensity accelerates the brain's compensatory responses. The dopamine system's downregulation, which took years of amphetamine use to reach a critical threshold, could reach that threshold with meth in months. Psychosis, not paranoid suspicion, but genuine breaks from reality, with hallucinations and delusional thinking, appeared in long-term meth users at rates that had no parallel in pharmaceutical amphetamine use. Drivers who had been functional for 15 years on benzodrine were becoming visibly erratic after 2 or 3 years on crank. The accidents that resulted were different too. Not just fatigued drivers drifting across centre lines during rebound. Drivers making decisions that had no logical foundation, accelerating instead of braking, ignoring obvious road hazards, responding to things that weren't there. The toxicology reports, when they happened, showed methamphetamine. The official records, when they were filed, still said driver impairment. The language remained carefully vague. here is where the story produces one of its most disturbing reversals. The conservative political coalition that launched and sustained the war on drugs through the 1980s drew enormous support from rural America, precisely the communities most deeply affected by meth production and consumption. The same voters whose towns hosted the labs, whose neighbours drove the trucks, whose local economies depended on the commerce those trucks carried, were simultaneously supporting a drug war that was devastating urban communities for crack cocaine, while their own methamphetamine crisis grew largely unaddressed. The political disconnect was not accidental. It reflected a genuine difference in how the two drug problems were being perceived, framed, and prioritised by the people with the power to act on them. Federal drug enforcement in rural trucking corridors during this period was measurably less aggressive than in urban areas, with fewer resources, lower arrest rates relative to estimated use, and substantially lighter sentencing for the meth-related convictions that did occur. The disparity was documented, debated in academic criminology, and changed very slowly. Meanwhile, the supply kept moving. The Teamsters Union, which had for decades failed to seriously address the stimulant dependency in its membership, found itself in the 1980s facing a problem that had grown beyond any organisational capacity it might have mustered even with the best intentions. Meth was not a union problem, a company problem, or a regulatory problem. It was a systemic problem, embedded in the economics, the culture, the geography, and the operational logic of an industry that the entire country depended on, and that nobody wanted to look at directly. What finally forced a partial reckoning wasn't moral clarity or political courage, it was the pseudoephedrine supply chain. In the early 1990s, meth cooks shifted increasingly from the Birch reduction method to a process using pseudoephedrine, the active ingredient in common cold medications like Sudafed, as the primary precursor. The new method produced higher purity product more consistently, but it required large quantities of pseudoephedrine, which meant purchasing it in volume from pharmacies and wholesalers. By the mid-1990s, the scale of pseudoephedrine diversion was visible enough to attract congressional attention, not because of the trucking industry's meth problem, but because the same supply networks were beginning to feed a broader civilian meth epidemic that was appearing in suburban and even urban areas. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 placed pseudoephedrine purchases behind pharmacy counters, imposed purchase limits, and required ID verification. It disrupted domestic meth production significantly and temporarily. The vacuum was filled within 3 years by Mexican drug trafficking organizations, which had the resources and infrastructure to produce methamphetamine at industrial scale and distribute it through existing smuggling networks. The domestic small-scale cook near the truck stop was gradually replaced by a supply chain that was larger, more efficient, and entirely beyond the reach of any domestic regulatory intervention. The drug had changed again. The supply had changed again. The demand, a trucking industry still running on impossible schedules, still paying drivers by the mile, still treating human endurance as a variable to be optimized, had not changed at all. It never had. Every adaptation in the drug supply over 60 years had been a response to that unchanged demand. And the demand, in the mid-2000s, was about to receive a new set of tools that would make everything that came before look almost quaint. The American story is the most documented, the most litigated, and the most politically processed version of a phenomenon that was simultaneously unfolding on every inhabited continent. The specific drugs changed. The roads changed. The political systems surrounding the industry changed. The fundamental equation, a global economy demanding that goods move faster than human bodies could naturally sustain, did not change anywhere. And everywhere that equation existed, the same solution appeared independently, with the reliability of a chemical reaction finding its equilibrium. Japan arrived at the crisis first, and with the least ambiguity about its origins. During the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese military had distributed Hirapon, methamphetamine, manufactured by the Dainippon Pharmaceutical Company, to soldiers, factory workers, and pilots with bureaucratic efficiency. The drug was marketed domestically with a cheerfulness that requires some effort to process historically. Advertisements depicted bright-eyed workers and soldiers alongside slogans promoting alertness and productivity. Hirapon wasn't hidden. It was a feature of the war economy, openly integrated into the production logic of a nation running at maximum industrial intensity. When the war ended and the military distribution apparatus dissolved, the Japanese government made the decision that would define the country's post-war drug landscape for a generation. Existing stockpiles of Hirapon, manufactured for military distribution but now surplus, were released into the civilian market. The reasoning was economic rather than sinister. The stockpiles had value, the country needed revenue, and the drug was legal. By 1948, it was being sold in pharmacies, bars, and street stalls across Japanese cities. Truck drivers, factory workers, construction labourers, and exhausted reconstruction workers consumed it in quantities that transformed what had been a military logistics tool into a full civilian epidemic. By 1954, Japanese health authorities estimated that 550,000 people were dependent on methamphetamine, in a country whose total population was approximately 88 million. The visible social devastation forced legislative action. Hirapon was banned in 1951, and enforcement began in earnest through the mid-1950s. Japan suppressed its first meth epidemic through a combination of aggressive prosecution and genuine public health intervention, a model that worked within the specific context of a highly organized post-war society with strong state capacity. The epidemic receded. The memory of it shaped Japanese drug policy for the rest of the 20th century in ways that made the country simultaneously one of the strictest in the world on drug enforcement and one of the most knowledgeable about what industrial stimulant use actually produces. Germany's version of the story predated Japan's and was darker in its operational context. Pervitin, the German methamphetamine tablet, manufactured by the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company, was distributed to Wehrmacht forces beginning in 1940 with a thoroughness that the Nazi military machine applied to all logistical problems. During the invasion of France, supply records show that approximately 35 million Pervitin tablets were distributed to German Army and Air Force personnel over a 3-month period. The Blitzkrieg's pace, the 60-hour tank advances that stunned Allied commanders who had calculated such movements to be physically impossible, was not purely tactical innovation. It was pharmacological. German soldiers who covered 50 miles in a single night were doing it on methamphetamine, and the High Command knew this, had planned for it, and considered it a legitimate military technology. The post-war German reckoning with Pervitin was complicated by the broader project of processing the Nazi period, which consumed so much moral and political energy that the specific question of military drug use became a footnote. It was documented but not centrally examined until German historian Norman Ohler's research in the 2000s brought Pervitin into mainstream historical awareness. The delay mattered because it meant that the German logistical industry, rebuilding rapidly in the post-war economic miracle, had no particular cultural inoculation against stimulant use in freight transport. West German truckers developing their own relationship with stimulants in the 1950s and 60s were operating in a society that had collectively agreed not to examine too closely what its recent relationship with those same chemicals had produced. Australia developed its own distinctly regional version of the story, shaped by geography that makes American interstate distances look modest. The Nullarbor Plain, a flat, featureless stretch of southern Australia, running approximately 1,200 kilometres between the settled east and the isolated west, presented long-haul drivers with a challenge that had no comfortable solution. The road across the Nullarbor had no towns of any significance for most of its length. Fuel stops were separated by distances that required planning. Wildlife struck vehicles unpredictably at night, and the economic structure of Australian freight, even more dominated by owner-operators than the American system, created the same per-mile incentive to keep moving that had defined the American industry from its beginning. Australian truckers developed their own stimulant vocabulary and their own supply networks, adapted to the specific geography of the continent. Speed, amphetamine sulfate typically, circulated through the industry from the 1960s onward. By the 1980s, the Australian trucking industry's drug problem was sufficiently visible to generate parliamentary inquiries, industry reviews, and a series of road safety initiatives that addressed the symptoms with persistent creativity and the causes with persistent reluctance. The fundamental economic structure that made stimulant use rational from a driver's perspective was not touched by any of these interventions. The Soviet experience ran parallel to the Western one, but through a different institutional channel. Soviet military logistics in World War II used Pervitin captured from German supplies and produced under Soviet pharmaceutical programs to sustain supply lines that covered distances the European theatre never approached. The Eastern Front's supply chains ran thousands of kilometres through terrain that made the American interstate system look hospitable. Soviet military pharmacologists were well aware of amphetamines' utility and dependency risks by the war's end. What happened to that knowledge inside the closed Soviet system, how it influenced the management of the civilian trucking industry that moved goods across the USSR's 11 time zones, is less thoroughly documented but consistent with the broader pattern. Stimulant use in Soviet freight transport was reported by defectors and later by Russian researchers examining the period with post-Soviet access to archives. The most unexamined and currently ongoing version of this story exists in South Asia. India and Pakistan together operate one of the world's largest road freight networks, covering a subcontinent whose road distances rival anything in North America or Australia. The drivers who cover these routes, often in poorly maintained vehicles, on roads that make American interstates look luxurious, through traffic densities that would paralyze a Western driver, operate under economic conditions of extreme pressure. The per-mile pay structure, the owner-operator dominance, the absence of meaningful hours of service enforcement, and the cultural premium on endurance all replicate the American trucking environment of the 1950s with almost exact fidelity. The drug they use is called chemical in the common parlance of Pakistani truck stops, or nasha in various regional Indian contexts, a crude mixture of amphetamine, methamphetamine, and various adulterants produced locally and sold openly at roadside stalls that also sell tea and cigarettes. It is not a secret. Researchers who have studied South Asian trucking have documented its use with a casualness that reflects how normalized the practice is, drivers discussing their consumption the way a Western office worker might discuss their coffee intake, as a practical tool for a demanding job rather than a transgression of any social or legal norm. The road accident rate in India and Pakistan, among the highest in the world in absolute and per capita terms, exists in a complicated relationship with this stimulant culture that neither government has been willing to examine rigorously. The drugs contribute to accidents through the same mechanisms they always have: false confidence during peak effect, catastrophic rebound at the end of the cycle, long-term impairment from chronic use. But they also, genuinely, keep drivers functional on roads and schedules that would otherwise be impossible. The removal of the chemical prop without a corresponding transformation of the economic and infrastructural conditions that make it necessary would not produce safer roads. It would produce roads with fewer trucks on them, which is a different kind of crisis entirely. This is the global picture that the American story, for all its documentation and litigation and congressional testimony, had always implied but rarely stated plainly. The problem was never American. It was never specific to any drug, any decade, or any regulatory regime. It was the inevitable output of an economic system that required goods to move at a pace human biology couldn't sustain, operating across every culture and geography on Earth that had roads and commerce and the need to connect them. The specific stimulants were almost incidental. Benzodrine, Pervitin, Hieropon, crank, chemical, different names, different molecular structures, different cultural contexts, identical function. They were all prosthetics for a biological limitation that the global economy had decided, without ever quite stating the decision, was not a real constraint. Every nation that built a road freight industry made that decision. Most of them are still living with the consequences, and most of the trucks are still moving. Statistics are how systems talk about people when they don't want to talk about people. The accident rates, the dependency percentages, the correlation coefficients in insurance actuarial tables. All of it is real data describing real damage, processed through a language designed to make the damage manageable, categorizable, and therefore easier to absorb without feeling its full weight. Behind every number in every report that every regulatory body produced about the American trucking industry's stimulant problem was a specific human being whose specific life was being consumed by a system that needed him functional enough to drive and didn't particularly care what happened to him after. The body of a long-haul trucker who'd been using stimulants for a decade told a story that the logbooks and delivery records never captured. Cardiovascular damage was the most immediate and measurable consequence. Amphetamine and methamphetamine both elevate heart rate and blood pressure with each dose, not dramatically, not in ways that felt alarming in the moment, but consistently and cumulatively over thousands of doses across years of use. The arterial walls thickened. The heart muscle adapted to sustained elevated workload by changing its structure in ways that reduced its long-term efficiency. Cardiologists who treated truckers in this era became familiar with a particular presentation. A man in his early to mid-40s with a cardiovascular profile of someone 15 years older, often presenting with his first serious cardiac event without any prior diagnosis, because he hadn't seen a doctor regularly since his commercial license physical. The licensing physical was its own dark comedy within this story. Federal regulations required that commercial drivers pass a DOT physical every 2 years. The physical included a blood pressure check, a vision test, a hearing assessment, and a general health evaluation. It was conducted by any licensed physician, not a specialist, not someone with particular expertise in occupational medicine or stimulant effects. A driver who was chronically hypertensive from years of amphetamine use could prepare for his physical by avoiding stimulants for 48 hours beforehand, drinking water, and sitting quietly in the waiting room until his blood pressure dropped to a passing level. The system for detecting health problems that the system had created was designed, whether intentionally or through spectacular negligence, to be defeatable by anyone motivated enough to defeat it. Most drivers were motivated enough. The license was the livelihood. Losing the license meant losing everything: the truck, the income, the identity. Trucking culture had built the driver's professional identity around precisely the qualities that made admitting health problems impossible: toughness, self-sufficiency, the capacity to endure what ordinary men couldn't. A driver who told his doctor that he had chest pain on long runs and took methamphetamine to get through them was a driver who might lose his CDL. So he told the doctor nothing, passed his physical, and drove away with a cardiovascular system quietly building toward a crisis that would arrive on a schedule nobody could predict and nobody was monitoring. The dental destruction that accompanied long-term stimulant use was visible in a way that cardiovascular damage was not. Amphetamine and methamphetamine both reduce saliva production dramatically. Saliva is not merely a digestive fluid. It is the primary defense mechanism against oral bacterial growth, and its absence allows acid-producing bacteria to devastate enamel at a rate that dentists associate with severe neglect. Combined with the teeth grinding that stimulant use produces during peak effect and the sugar-heavy diet common in truck-stop food culture, the oral health of long-term stimulant-using drivers deteriorated in ways that were impossible to hide and that carried their own social consequences. A man whose teeth had been destroyed by his occupation looked, to the outside world, like a man who had made terrible personal choices. The occupation was invisible. The choices were all the external world could see. The neurological damage accumulated more slowly than the physical damage but lasted longer. The dopamine system's downregulation, once established through years of stimulant use, does not fully reverse with abstinence. Studies conducted in the 1990s and 2000s on long-term methamphetamine users found structural changes in the brain's reward circuitry that persisted for years after the drug was stopped. Reduced dopamine transporter density, decreased metabolic activity in the prefrontal cortex, measurable cognitive impairment in tasks requiring executive function and working memory. A driver who stopped using meth after 10 years on the road didn't recover a normal brain. He recovered a permanently altered one, with a reduced capacity for motivation, pleasure, and complex decision-making that would shape the rest of his life, regardless of whether he ever touched a drug again. The families experienced all of this at close range, with no framework for understanding it and no support structure to help them manage it. The wife of a long-haul trucker in 1975 did not have access to addiction medicine specialists, occupational health counsellors, or peer support groups organised around the specific experience of loving someone whose brain chemistry had been reorganised by occupational stimulant use. What she had was a husband who was present in the house between runs, but absent in every way that mattered. Flat, irritable, unable to engage with the texture of ordinary family life, sleeping at strange hours, eating poorly, flinching at noise, and periodically exploding at minor provocations with a disproportionate intensity that nobody in the family had words for. Children in these households grew up with a particular understanding of their fathers, men who existed most fully somewhere else, on a road that the family couldn't follow, in a version of themselves that the domestic world never quite saw. The fathers who came home between runs were diminished versions, chemically depleted, psychologically absent, present in body while the part of them that the road required was somewhere in the process of reconstituting itself for the next departure. Some children of truckers from this era describe their fathers with an ambivalence that carries a specific texture. Pride in the work, confusion about the man, a sense of having been raised partly by an absence that wore their father's face. The divorce statistics were consistent and damning across the decades. Long-haul trucking had among the highest divorce rates of any American occupation throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, a figure the industry attributed to the structural stress of prolonged separation and the difficulty of maintaining intimacy across the distances the job required. These factors were real, but they explained only part of the pattern. The other part, the dependency, the personality changes, the inability to be present even when physically home, was the part that the industry's self-analysis consistently failed to examine. The suicide data, when researchers finally began to assemble it systematically in the 1990s and early 2000s, was the number that sat most heavily in the literature. A comprehensive study published in 2002, drawing on death certificate data across multiple states and controlling for age, income, and geographic distribution, found that long-haul truck drivers died by suicide at a rate approximately 2.7 times the national average for men of comparable demographic profiles. The elevated rate was not explained by the structural factors alone: separation, economic stress, social isolation. Those factors elevated risk, but not to that degree. What elevated it to that degree was the combination of those factors with the neurological aftermath of chronic stimulant use. A brain depleted of its natural capacity for reward and motivation, housed in a body worn down by years of physical stress, belonging to a man in a culture that had no vocabulary for vulnerability and no institutional tolerance for admitting weakness. These men died quietly mostly, not in crashes that made the news, not in ways that generated congressional testimony or insurance actuarial reports. They died in the specific privacy of men who had been trained by their industry and their culture to manage everything alone, and who found, at the end of that management, that there was nothing left to manage with. The support structures that eventually emerged, peer counseling programs organized through trucking associations in the 1990s, occupational health initiatives run by some of the larger carriers, informal networks that formed around truck stop chaplaincy programs, arrived decades after the damage they were addressing had been accumulating. They helped some people. They reached a fraction of the population that needed them. The cultural resistance to seeking help in an industry that had built its identity around not needing it meant that the most damaged men were also the least likely to access whatever support existed. What the human cost of this story adds up to, across 60 years, across tens of thousands of drivers, across the families and communities that absorb the damage at one remove, is a number that nobody has ever calculated completely, because the accounting was never designed to capture it. The official record shows accidents, liability settlements, regulatory violations, and drug convictions. It does not show the cumulative weight of all the lives that were diminished rather than ended, altered rather than destroyed, consumed gradually by a system that needed everything from the men at its centre and offered them, in return, a pill and a schedule and the open road. The year 1997 marks a quiet but significant threshold in the stimulant history of American trucking. Red Bull arrived on the United States market, and within 18 months it was the fastest-selling beverage at truck stops from Florida to Oregon. The timing was not accidental. The trucking industry was in the middle of a stimulant transition. Meth increasingly visible and increasingly risky, pharmaceutical amphetamine tightly controlled, the old ephedrine products under growing regulatory scrutiny. Into that gap stepped a product that contained caffeine and taurine, in concentrations carefully calibrated to stay below FDA thresholds, for mandatory warning labels, marketed with the kind of aggressive masculinity that truck stop culture responded to immediately, and priced at a point that made buying 3 or 4 in a shift economically trivial. Energy drinks were not, by any clinical measure, equivalent to amphetamine. Their stimulant effect was milder, shorter, and less pharmacologically disruptive. But their role in the system was identical: chemical compensation for a biological deficit created by a schedule no human being should have been keeping. And their legal status, combined with their aggressive marketing and their complete absence from any drug testing protocol, made them the perfect public face of a stimulant culture that had learned to hide itself behind legitimacy. The trucking industry embraced them with the enthusiasm of an industry that had spent 30 years trying to solve an amphetamine problem without addressing its cause. Energy drinks were legal, they were taxable, they were sold at the company-owned fuel stops that many large carriers operated. They generated revenue while serving the same operational function that Benzedrine had served in 1952. The system had found a way to monetize the stimulant dependency it had created. This was, in the long history of this particular story, a new low that somehow felt like progress. Modafinil arrived in the American market in 1998, approved by the FDA for narcolepsy treatment. Its mechanism differed fundamentally from amphetamine. Rather than flooding the brain with dopamine, it appeared to work primarily through histamine pathways, promoting wakefulness without the intense euphoria or the severe rebound of classical stimulants. The military noticed immediately. DARPA funded research into modafinil's potential for sustaining soldier performance across extended operations. The Air Force approved it for pilots on long missions. The drug's cleaner profile, lower dependency risk, less dramatic crash, no significant cardiovascular strain, made it attractive to anyone whose job required sustained wakefulness and who had reasons to avoid the baggage that came with amphetamine. The off-label prescription of modafinil to truck drivers began almost as soon as the drug became available, and it accelerated steadily through the early 2000s as awareness of its effect spread through professional networks. A driver who told a doctor he had trouble staying alert on long shifts, framing the occupational reality as a medical symptom, could often walk out with a modafinil prescription that was entirely legal, carried no Schedule II restrictions, and produced no positive result on standard amphetamine drug tests. The prescription mills of the 1970s had been reborn in a cleaner, more defensible form. The drug was different. The logic was identical, but the most transformative development in the modern trucking industry's relationship with human endurance wasn't pharmaceutical at all. It was algorithmic. The rise of logistics optimization software and its perfection in the hands of companies like Amazon, Walmart, and UPS created a new form of pressure on drivers that made the dispatcher with a pill jar look almost benign by comparison. An algorithm doesn't negotiate. It doesn't respond to fatigue or weather or the specific circumstances of a human being having a difficult shift. It calculates the optimal route, assigns the delivery window, and measures performance against the calculation with a precision and consistency that no human supervisor ever achieved. Amazon's delivery network, which expanded from a modest logistics operation to the most sophisticated private supply chain in human history between 2005 and 2020, built its performance standards on algorithmic modeling that assumed near-perfect execution from its drivers. The delivery windows that customers tracked on their phones, the 2-hour windows, the same-day delivery promises, the notifications that a package was 5 stops away, were generated by systems that had calculated exactly how long each stop should take, how long each driving segment should require, and what overall daily output constituted acceptable performance. The human being driving the route was a variable in the calculation, not a participant in setting it. Electronic logging devices, ELDs, became mandatory for most commercial truck drivers under a 2017 FMCSA rule that was designed to eliminate the comic book logbook fraud that had defined the industry since the 1950s. The devices connected directly to the truck's engine, recording driving time automatically and transmitting the data to carriers and regulators in real time. Drivers could no longer falsify their hours. The 11-hour driving limit and the 10-hour rest requirement were now enforced by hardware, not by the honor system. The industry had expected this to solve the fatigue problem. What it produced instead was something more insidious. Drivers, unable to extend their hours illegally, began treating the 11-hour limit not as a maximum to approach cautiously, but as a target to hit precisely, driving to the edge of the legal window regardless of how fatigued they actually were, because the economic pressure to maximize miles hadn't diminished with the arrival of the technology. The ELD enforced the letter of the regulation, while the economic structure of the industry systematically undermined its spirit. And the stimulant use continued. A 2019 study published in the journal Occupational and Environmental Medicine analysed drug test results from over 1.8 million commercial driver tests conducted between 2013 and 2017. Amphetamine positivity rates had increased by 35% over that period. Not decreased, increased during the years when ELD adoption was expanding and regulatory pressure was at its highest in the industry's history. The drivers finding stimulants weren't using them despite the regulations. They were using them because of the pressure the regulations created, because an ELD that capped driving hours while an algorithm demanded impossible delivery numbers created a gap that chemistry was filling, exactly as it always had. The specific stimulants had evolved again. Alongside energy drinks and modafinil, a new generation of legal cognitive enhancers, marketed as nootropics, positioned as brain optimization tools rather than drugs, had entered the truck stop retail environment. Products containing phenylethylamine, phenephrine, and various proprietary blends of compounds that produce stimulant effects without meeting the chemical definitions that would trigger regulatory scheduling filled the supplement aisle with a profusion that made the old trucker's friend display look sparse. The regulatory framework that the Controlled Substances Act had established was being outpaced by medicinal chemistry, which could produce new compounds faster than scheduling processes could classify them. The drug testing protocols that large carriers and the DOT used to screen drivers were perpetually behind this curve. A driver who knew which compounds triggered a positive amphetamine test and which did not could navigate the supplement market with reasonable confidence. The knowledge circulated through driver forums and trucking social media with the same peer-to-peer efficiency that pill information had circulated through CB radio networks 40 years earlier. The channel had changed. The content was recognizable. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, which compressed a decade of supply chain stress into 18 months and revealed with brutal clarity how thin the margin between normal operation and catastrophic failure had always been. Driver shortages that had been manageable became critical. Delivery demand spiked simultaneously. The pressure on drivers who remained in the workforce reached levels that the industry's own trade publications described, with unusual candor, as unsustainable. Stimulant use, documented in testing data and anecdotally reported in driver surveys, increased sharply during 2020 and 2021. The same systems that had always responded to impossible demand with chemical compensation responded again, reflexively, because the underlying logic had never been addressed. A 2022 FMCSA analysis of drug and alcohol testing data found that amphetamine-class stimulants remained the most common positive result in commercial driver testing, accounting for nearly 40% of all drug violations recorded. The figure represented only drivers caught by testing, random tests, post-accident tests, reasonable suspicion tests. The population of drivers using stimulants who were not caught by any test in any given year was, by the methodology of addiction epidemiology, substantially larger. The best estimates placed regular stimulant use among long-haul drivers at somewhere between 15% and 30% of the active workforce, numbers almost identical to what the buried 1965 industry report had found, 6 decades and an entire pharmaceutical revolution later. The technology had changed completely. The regulation had multiplied enormously. The drugs were different. The trucks were different. The roads were mapped by satellite and the hours were recorded by computers. Everything had been modernized except the one thing that had driven the problem from the beginning: the expectation that a human being could cover the distances the economy required in the time the economy demanded without paying a price that the economy refused to account for. There is a particular kind of institutional failure that doesn't look like failure while it's happening. It looks like management. It looks like adaptation, regulation, adjustment. The normal machinery of a complex system responding to problems as they arise. The American trucking industry's 8-decade relationship with stimulants looks, from a sufficient distance, like exactly this kind of managed evolution. A problem identified, regulations passed, drugs rescheduled, testing implemented, technology deployed. Progress, measured in the language that systems use to describe themselves, measure it differently, and the picture inverts completely. In 1952, a dispatcher kept Benzedrine on his desk because the schedule demanded more than a human body could naturally deliver. In 2024, an algorithm generates a delivery window because the market demands more than a human body can naturally deliver. The desk is gone. The pill jar is gone. The dispatcher has been replaced by software that doesn't need to feel complicit because it isn't capable of feeling anything. But the gap between what is demanded and what a human being can provide, that gap has not closed. It has been institutionalized, optimized, and made invisible behind a layer of technological sophistication that mistakes precision for justice. Every regulatory intervention in this story followed the same structural pattern. A visible problem accumulates until it generates sufficient political pressure for a response. The response targets the most visible symptom, a specific drug, a specific practice, a specific loophole, without touching the economic conditions that produce the symptom. This symptom migrates. A new form of the same problem emerges in the space created by the regulation. The cycle repeats. Benzedrine becomes prescription only, and ephedrine fills the gap. Ephedrine products come under scrutiny, and methamphetamine fills the gap. Domestic meth production is disrupted, and cartel supply fills the gap. Each intervention generated its own literature of success, enforcement statistics, reduced availability metrics, positive test rate reductions in specific compounds, while the underlying stimulant use rate among long-haul drivers remained, across 6 decades of intervention, within the same general range it had occupied in 1965. The Teamsters Union, which represented the largest organised constituency of the affected workers, carries a specific weight in this accounting. The union had the institutional power, the legal standing, and the moral obligation to demand working conditions that didn't require chemical supplementation to survive. It had the ability to negotiate rest requirements with teeth, to push for pay structures based on hours rather than miles, eliminating the per-mile incentive that made skipping rest economically rational. Instead, throughout the decades when the dependency was building and the damage was accumulating, the union's leadership was consumed by internal power struggles, entangled with organised crime in ways that compromised its independence, and broadly reluctant to challenge the operational logic of an industry whose cooperation it needed to maintain its own institutional position. The workers paid for that reluctance with their bodies and their lives, and the union filed the paperwork. The trucking companies occupy a more straightforward position in the moral accounting because their incentives were always transparent and they followed them with consistency. A company that paid by the mile had every financial reason to want drivers covering maximum miles. A company whose drivers used stimulants to cover more miles was a company whose bottom line benefited directly from that use. The liability exposure was real but manageable. Settlements with confidentiality clauses, insurance that distributed the cost across the market, regulatory relationships maintained through lobbying that kept enforcement selective and penalties modest. The math consistently favoured continuation over reform, and the companies consistently did the math. The federal regulatory apparatus, the DOT, the FMCSA, the DEA, produced an enormous volume of rules, studies, enforcement actions and policy initiatives across this period that, assembled into a stack, would constitute an impressive monument to institutional activity. What it would not constitute is evidence of a system that solved the problem it was tasked with solving. The hours of service regulations existed for decades before ELDs made them enforceable, and when ELDs arrived, they discovered that the regulations, enforced precisely, still didn't produce safe outcomes because the economic structure around them remained unchanged. The drug testing program caught a fraction of stimulant users and created a market for masking agents and unscheduled compounds. The licensing system's physical examination requirements were defeated by every motivated driver who understood how to defeat them. None of this represents unique corruption or unusual incompetence. It represents the ordinary operation of regulatory systems that are structurally positioned to manage symptoms rather than address causes, because causes in this case were the economic foundations of an industry too large and too essential to confront directly. The consumer sits at the end of this chain, and the consumer's role in it deserves a clear accounting. Every person who has felt the mild irritation of a delayed package, who has refreshed a tracking page and noticed with mild annoyance that the estimated delivery has slipped by a day, who has selected 2-day shipping with the casual expectation of an entitlement, every one of those people is a participant in the demand structure that the system was built to serve. The demand for fast, cheap delivery is not a corporate invention imposed on a reluctant public. It is a genuine consumer preference, expressed billions of times daily through purchasing decisions, that the logistics industry has optimized itself to meet at the lowest possible cost. The lowest possible cost has always been paid by the person behind the wheel, not by the algorithm, not by the shareholder, not by the customer tracking the package from a warm room. By the specific human being on a specific dark highway, making a specific decision about whether to pull over or push through, a decision that the entire weight of the economic system surrounding him had already made on his behalf, decades before he sat down behind that wheel. The automation argument, the claim that self-driving trucks will eventually dissolve this problem entirely, deserves the skepticism that technological solutions to systemic problems have historically earned. Autonomous trucking technology is real, advancing, and will eventually handle a significant portion of long-haul freight. But the transition will take decades, will be geographically and economically uneven, and will create its own categories of human cost in the form of displaced workers and restructured labour markets. And the fundamental principle that produced the stimulant problem, that the economy's demand for movement takes priority over the human cost of providing it, will not be resolved by replacing human drivers with software. It will simply find new human bodies to externalize its costs onto elsewhere in the supply chain. What would actually change the equation is a restructuring of the economic logic that sits at the center of it. Pay structures based on hours rather than miles would eliminate the per-mile incentive to skip rest. Delivery windows set to realistic rather than optimal timelines would remove the algorithmic pressure that ELDs can restrict but not address. Shipper liability for driver fatigue, a policy framework in which the company setting the delivery window bears legal responsibility for the conditions its requirements create, would distribute the cost of impossible schedules to the entities with the most power to change them. These are not radical proposals. They are the obvious mechanical solutions to a mechanical problem. They have been proposed in various forms by safety researchers and driver advocates for decades. They have not been implemented at any scale that changes the underlying reality, because implementing them would make fast delivery more expensive, and more expensive fast delivery is a political problem that no administration has been willing to own. So the trucks keep moving, the algorithms keep calculating, the stimulants keep changing their names and their molecular structures, while their function stays identical. filling the gap between what the human body can do and what the economic system requires it to do. The drivers keep making the decision that the system has already made for them, somewhere between the last truck stop and the next delivery window, on a highway that stretches in both directions into the dark. The Benzedrine in the glove compartment in Nebraska in 1952 and the modafinil in a driver's bag on E80 in 2024 are separated by 70 years of regulation, litigation, pharmaceutical innovation, and technological transformation. They are separated by almost nothing in terms of what they represent. A system's answer to a question it refuses to stop asking, handed to a person it refuses to fully see on a road that never ends. The shelves stay full. The packages arrive. The cost is somewhere out there in the dark, moving at speed, and most people never think to ask who's paying it.